workshop. And so in the next block, I'm now going to introduce two experts in the private sector as a moderator, as certified by the International Standard of Certification. We have Billie Jo Mary Johnson. She has a graduate in the university with a specialization in biology and chemistry. She started her work 20 years ago as a microbiologist working with medical devices for human and animal tissues. She's worked in companies for medical devices that include bandages and permanent implants. She worked at the FDA, also carrying out surveillances and auditing of all medical devices and their sterilization. And she's also worked in different areas like CAPA, complaints, quality management, and corporate audit, etc. She's certified by the United States Office for Quality since 2001, and she's currently the project manager for Reclassification, a global company for products and facilities. And to moderate this session, we're going to have also Eamon Hoxie. He is an auditor and a trainer in several life sciences, including standardized compliance, quality, and others. Eamon graduated from the United States. He graduated at the Bath University in the UK in pharmacy and had a doctorate in pharmaceutical microbiologist. He worked for Johnson & Johnson for 17 years in different responsibilities for medical devices, medical products, and consumer products. And these include the vice presidents of compliance, of market and strategic programs, and releasing the quality program for the release of medical devices in the European Union for the same company. He was also the head of technology and devices for the device office of the UK and has worked in different work groups, including ISO groups. He's been a former chair of the directors meeting for the progress of medical devices, and he's also helping in the development of standards. And so, Eamon, you have the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. It's a great pleasure to moderate this this session. And so what I would like to do is just make a few generic remarks about the approach of auditing organizations to ISO 13485. Before I hand over to Billie Jo, who's going to talk in detail about the certification process operated by auditing organizations. So I want to talk a little bit, just for a minute or two, about how different auditing organizations can be recognized as having competence in this area, just building on what Fred talked about, specifically about Canada and MDSAP. So when we talk about accreditation of auditing organizations, this is really intended to ensure that conformity assessment bodies, and conformity assessment body is a general term which can be turned in different jurisdictions into more specific terms, as we heard from Fred. So in Canada, it might be called a registrar. In Europe, it might be called a notified body. Under MDSAP, it might be called an auditing organization. In the UK, post leaving the European Union, they're called authorized bodies, but they might have different roles in different jurisdictions, but essentially they're undertaking a conformity assessment exercise, and they need to have the technical capacity to conform their duties. And it can be used, accreditation can apply in regulated and voluntary areas, and is intended to make sure that we can have confidence in conformity assessment and reinforce mutual recognition, be it for products, services, systems, or organizations. So the accreditation infrastructure consists of an organization that looks after the oversight of the body. There can be general requirements for those bodies and sector-specific requirements, so specific things that the medical device sector, for example, might need, and specific guidance for organizations in operating in those sectors. So ISO, the International Standards Organization, has a committee called CASCO, which looks at the overall policy and publishes standards on conformity assessment. And in this area, the 17021 series of standards is the important one. This is a standard in 10 parts, but part 1 gives the general requirements for organizations that are doing audits and certifying management systems. And part 3 has specific competence requirements for quality management system conformity assessment organizations. Fred mentioned that the process and went through the process for that MDSAP uses for assessment of auditing organizations. Other organizations that do accreditation have very similar sort of processes that they go through. So the European process is very similar to the MDSAP process and uses both office assessments and or witnessed audits of the performance of audits by teams made up from across the European Union countries. In the UK, the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency oversees the approval or the recognition of authorized bodies in the UK. So you can see that that process that was discussed in detail for MDSAP assessment of auditing organizations can be applied with some tweaks in different jurisdictions to meet different requirements. But essentially that oversight is intended to ensure that we have the technical capacity in those organizations in terms of their resources, their expertise, their independence, and their capacity. So with that, just very brief oversight of the oversight of auditing organizations or conformity assessment bodies. It's a pleasure to hand over to Billy Joe Johnson. BJ is going to give an overview of the work of an auditing organization in providing certification to ISO 13485. Billy Joe, I'd hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me just share my screen here. All right, so just as kind of a preface a little bit to the presentation as is. One is I do use the word notified body as we're European-based headquarters. That's what we call ourselves. I know we've talked about the different names, but I'll just note in here that in my presentation, I do call out notified bodies. The other thing is that the DECRA process has separate certifications for ISO 13485, MDSAP, Europe, CE marking, that kind of stuff. I did focus this presentation on ISO 1345. There's very minimalistic changes really between that and the MDSAP process. So what we'll go through today is just a little bit about what is a certificate, how our application process works, our audit process, the audit reports that we prepare, and then how that certificate gets issued to a manufacturer.
BJ, I'm sorry.
Yes.
We're seeing your presenter mode, not presentation mode. So if you could switch.
I can do that if I can remember stop share.
Okay, thank you.
Screen, this one. No, is that better?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first off, what is a certificate? So a certificate really is just a document that is produced to show that the organization is compliant to a quality management system. So we issue it to a specific standard, such as ISO 1345 or MDSAP. And in the case of ISO 1345 and MDSAP, they are only applicable for 3 years. So every 3 years, a new certificate is issued based on a new set of audits. We issue the certificates in digital and paper format. So most of ours nowadays do go out in a digital. It's a PDF that you as a manufacturing site can print off. However, if they request, we can send them paper copies as well. And they can cover multiple locations that have the same quality management system, in the sense of if you're a large organization, I think 3M was brought up before, they have multiple sites. If the quality management system is the same across each site, as in they use the exact same procedures and such, we can issue one certificate for ISO 13485 for the entire system, or in most of the cases, each individual site then will have its own certificate. The certificate documentation is pretty much pretty standard across the notified bodies. It'll have the name and location of the manufacturer. Like I said, if there's multiple sites, it will list every site that it covers. It'll have the effective date of the granting of the certificate, the expiration date, which will be the 3 years later, some type of unique identification code that ties it to that specific manufacturer. Each notified body auditing organization uses their own identification code. So you actually can kind of look at a certificate, sometimes number, and determine who is the organization that issued that. The management standard that is certified to, so in this case, it would say ISO 13485 or MDSAP. It also will contain the scope. The scope is really where we're saying, what's the type of activities that our audits have covered? As in, is it a design only? Do they do design manufacturing? Do they do sterilization activities? And then the product or service provided. And again, this is usually very generalistic. As was stated before, we don't put on ISO 13485 certificates part numbers. What we'll say is catheter manufacturing, or design and development of facial masks, something to that extent that's just very generalistic of what they're doing. It will have the name, address, and certification mark of the notified body. And it'll also have any other information that was required by the standard, which in most cases is not anything specific to that we add. But if there is something specific that would be called out that needs to be on there, we would add it. And then some type of revision control, so that we can tell that as the certificates are reissued, that the old certificate is no longer applicable. The new certificate is now the one that will be the one issued. Next, kind of want to just talk through the application process. So an organization applies to the notified body with the information of what type of certificate are they asking for. So we have, DECRA uses a specific form that says, do you want it to ISO only? Do you want MDSAP? Which countries are you applying to under the MDSAP program? We'll send that to submit that to us, sorry. It'll include what's their desired scope. Do they want to be a manufacturing facility? Are they a design only facility? The relevant details of the organization, the name, the address, who's actually responsible for contacting us, and who can we contact if we have questions. Any aspects that may be outsourced. Where this comes into play mainly is we have several what I would call small medical device manufacturers in the United States, where they are really only a design facility and the entire product is manufactured at a supplier. And in that case, we need to know who that supplier is and what they're doing, because they may be important to us as we go through our auditing process. And then we also ask if they've had a past certificate with someone, whether it's a valid certificate or one that has expired, who received that, what's the status of that certificate? Because in many cases, what we've seen, at least in the United States, is one organization might become overly burdened with clients. That person then moves from that organization to DECRA because we might have more capacity to do what there is to need to be done. We then review, obviously, the application, and we're just looking to say, do I have everything I need to make a proper assessment of whether or not DECRA can take on this process? Part of it, as was discussed earlier today, is training. If we don't have anybody within the organization that has the proper training in their products, we are not able to do their audits. We have to have the background to assure that we can understand the products that they're manufacturing. So like in the case of sterilization, if it is a facility that does nothing but sterilization, we need to make sure that we have somebody on staff that's been properly trained in that method of sterilization to go out and do those audits. We also will resolve any differences in understanding. So sometimes it's just a matter of clarification again of you stated this, I'm not really sure, please, confirm that this is what you meant or provide more information. Again, I could talk about the competence, and then just understanding that the client understands the time to complete this. A certification is not a 2-day process. Certificates in some cases have gone on between the audits and reviewing of different aspects of that a year before we can actually issue the certificate. So we want to be very clear that A, they understand that this is going to take several months in most cases, and also B, that their any kind of audit timing is based on the amount of information they've put in their application. As an example, how many products do they have? Are they applying for MDSAP in all 5 of the locations that are, applicable? Each of those items adds time to our audits. And so audits can be up to sometimes a full week with 3 people, depending on the size of the company. So we want to make sure they understand this process ahead of time before we start this, and they're surprised that we're going to show up for more or less 15 audit days. And then we will just kind of start setting up that initial audit with them, asking some questions, getting some information, but making sure that everything in this application is complete, and we can take it on and we can go ahead and start the audit process. So discussing audits and audit cycles. So like I said before, this is a 3-year cycle. We do conduct audits once a calendar year. So the plan is that the initial audit would be the first calendar year. Then the next audits would be the surveillance and another surveillance, and then a recertification. So that is a plan. There are instances where this sometimes can change, but we do make sure that during that cycle, we have covered every section of 1345 or MDSAP. In addition, we also have what we call special audits. Special audits are two main reasons that we use them. One is in case of contract manufacturers. If you're outsourcing your entire manufacturing process, we will not certify you under manufacturing within your scope unless we can actually view that manufacturing. So we will set up additional audits throughout that 3-year cycle where we do go out and visit the contract manufacturer to assure that they're following your processes and making a device that is to your specifications. They also sometimes are audits where if we find during the year problems, or if we're notified that there was a recall, we will sometimes do what we call corrective action audits, which means we're going to go out, check on these, make sure that there's nothing of concerns, especially for those MDSAP customers where we have requirements to report back on any issues that we found. So we will sometimes set up these special audits throughout the year just to make sure that everything is being covered and that we can still say, yes, we're saying that the certificate is still valid and that the products that they're selling that we feel still are under that certificate. Okay, so just a little tiny bit about our audit types. So we have what we call our initial certification audit. This means this is the first time you've come to DECRA. You've asked us to certify you to a specific standard. We have never done an audit at your facility in the past. And we need to start what we call from the beginning. So we do conduct these audits using the ISO 17021 and ISO 13485. 17021, as stated before, is more or less kind of telling us what to do, but we do use those as part of our scope. We do these audits in 2 stages. The first stage 1 is really just a documentation review. We tend to do these off-site. We have you submit all your documentation to us. We are reviewing just to see, is the documentation in order? And do we truly believe you're ready for a full audit to, so let's say ISO 1345 or MDSAP. In many cases, if your documentation does not actually meet the standard, there's no way that your audit actually is going to meet the standard as well when we come out to do processes. So we start just with the documentations. Once we agree that your documentation is compliant, we will then schedule what we call our stage 2 audit. This audit is then when we come on site, we will conduct the full audits of all the different quality management systems and make sure that anything that has changed from the time that you submitted your application to us and your documentation to us, that has not changed significantly in enough a way that we no longer feel that, you know, we should be doing these audits. So the stage 2 is really what I consider our audit. The stage 1 is more for the preparatory aspects to get ready for that. Stage 1 to stage 2, usually about 30 to 60 days in between them. It's just really to make sure that if we do have any concerns with your procedures, that those get updated prior to the stage 1. We do not issue non-conformances for a stage 1 audit. They can only be issued at this on-site stage 2. So in that case, we're trying to really stop something that's an easy fix from us having to write a non-conformance on. The next audits are the surveillance audits. Again, we have the same scope that we are auditing to. Again, there's 2 surveillance audits. So after the initial audit, the first surveillance audit will follow the first year, which would be the next year. So if you did your initial in 2021, your first surveillance audit would be in 2022. And then the second surveillance audit is 2 years later. So as an example, 2023. These surveillance audits are not necessarily full quality system audits. So in the stage 1, we will have looked at everything. In surveillance audits, we tend to break up the quality system in half. Half is done in one audit, half is in the other. There are some exceptions to this, mainly being complaints, adverse event reporting. We will look at every audit. We will double check to make sure your quality management system hasn't had any major changes. We will also assure that if there is anything from the last audit that was a non-conformance, that we will follow up on those each time. But in reality, these are just an audit to make sure that after our certification was granted, that you remain, or that the manufacturer remains under control within those, and that nothing has changed where we would have to start thinking about removing their certification. Next, we have what's then called a recertification audit. So we've now had an initial 2 surveillance. After the second surveillance, the next year usually, or well, I shouldn't say usually, the certificate will expire. So we will do what we call a recertification audit to make sure that we can give that certificate another 3 years of validity. So the purpose of these audits are really to just say, okay, they've continued to keep their quality management system satisfactory to whatever it is that we were auditing to, ISO 1345 or MDSAP. And that we've also said that there's been no change in the scope of certification. So they haven't added maybe a completely different product that we've not discussed in the past, or they've not decided to revamp the quality management system from the, and totally start over from blank and totally change it. We want to make sure that in that process that nothing has changed that would change how we scoped our certificate. We do note that these audits usually are shorter than the initial audits, because although we're still looking at the full quality management system, we're usually focusing our sampling on changes that have been made since the last time to see if they've changed the scope. They still are longer than a surveillance audit. They just might not be the full time that it took to do the initial audit. So audit reports. Obviously, the audit report is prepared using the template created by the notified body, with the exception of MDSAP. MDSAP does have its own audit report template that we will use. In the case of DECRA, we actually create what we call is our ISO 1345 report and also our MDSAP report. We keep them separate just so that depending on if it's, sometimes we get requests for countries to look at these reports and they may not be MDSAP's part of the MDSAP group, and they may not understand the way that that report is set up. So we keep our other report as more standard, as it's set up more standard for the ISO 1345 alone. It is important to note that each notified body has their own template. I would say I have worked in industry and for the FDA and the notified body now, all of our reports look different. There's similar aspects to them, but just the formatting, the way that things, non-conformances are recorded, all of that, it all slightly looks different. So it is important to know that if you're not doing MDSAP, you will get a report from each notified body that looks very different from one another. And it is important to note that the reports are prepared in the language of the notified body. So obviously in the US, that is all in English. However, for DECRA, our reports can be in either English or Dutch, as our headquarters are in the Netherlands. But TUV, I know, can do it in English or German. A lot of times it's where if you're located in the same country as the notified body, they'll do it in that language. And then English tends to be the general language everybody is used. So just a little bit about report contents. So like I said, each of these will look different, but this really is called out in ISO 17021. And so we all do assure that this information is in our reports. So we will have a cover page. The cover page just pretty much is identifying who is it that is the auditee and who is the auditing organization. So in our case, it'll have the manufacturer's name and address and our information as DECRA. It'll note the type of audit. So the criteria, objective, scope. So it'll note that is this just an ISO 1345 only audit? Does it have MDSAP applications as well? Are there other applications that we can do, such as European Union CE marking? And again, what objectives are we trying to meet when we go through this audit to make sure that we are audited and or regulations that are in that criteria. It'll notify, or it'll identify, the auditors and the audit dates. And in every report, there'll be some type of notification of nonconformances. So as the auditor, if I find that you have not met a specific section of the standard, I will note that as a nonconformance In our reports, it's fully documented in the report itself. Sometimes it can be a secondary form that gets attached to the report with that information on it. With these notifications of nonconformances, we also gather all the information from the manufacturer on their corrective actions that they've taken. And we will note whether or not we have viewed these actions, that they were completed, that we verified that everything they did was effective to stop whatever issue it was that we had noticed in the first place, and that we've closed that nonconformance. Any recommendations of the audit team? So part of this would be, we do make a statement in our audit reports that recommends certification to ISO 1345 or MDSAP. We also can recommend that additional audits can happen based on, we found that manufacturing has now moved to completely offsite contract manufacturer, so we'll recommend that a secondary audit is done on that. Those will all be noted in that report. We do make a disclaimer that the audit's based on sampling of records. We also make this very clear in our audits. It's just a reminder to people that I can come in one day, not find something, and another auditor can come in the day after me and find something because I didn't look at it. So it's a reminder to people that an audit is only a sample. I am not looking at every piece of paper in your facility. I'm looking at specific records. There might be something that I missed that somebody else might find. And then the last thing is just the conclusion that the audit was completed as expected, and also confirmation that all those objectives have been fulfilled. We will not issue a certificate if the objectives of the audits have not been fulfilled. So an example of that would be, I've gone out to do an audit. I have gotten to the manufacturer. There were boxes all over the place in the within the building. And so I asked the question as to, why are all these boxes here? It almost looked as if they were moving. And they said, yes, we've decided now that manufacturing of our products are going to be completely outsourced. We no longer will conduct manufacturing within this facility. My objective for that audit was to recertify their certificate, which included manufacturing as in scope. So in this case, I, at the end of the audit, was not able to actually renew their certificate. We had to set up a secondary audit at the facility they had moved all of the production to before I could issue that certificate to say, yes, that the scope could include design and manufacturing of medical devices. So we will note at the end of each audit in the report that, yes, all the objectives have been fulfilled, or no, they have not. And these are the actions that will be needed to fulfill those objectives. Handling of nonconformities, I just kind of wanted to bring this up just as, a bit of a refresher. So what is a nonconformity? It's a non-fulfillment of a requirement. It's, good example is that ISO 1345 says that if you receive a complaint, you must open a complaint file. So we have two different nonconformity types that we use. MDSAP, this will be something that is slightly different because they are graded, not listed as major and minor. But Fred did talk a little bit about that grading before. So there is a major nonconformity. So this means this usually how I explain this to people is, you have product that has left the building that is non-compliant to your specifications there, or you have a large gap in your quality management system that it causes us to have concerns whether or not you are actually being able to manufacture products to your specifications. We also do what we call it, take a number of minor nonconformities. If we have the same issue multiple times and slightly in different sections. So let's say you don't have procedures for complaints, for CAPAs, for supplier management. All of those could be separate minor nonconformities. However, when we look at it as a whole, as in your system for documentation control, it now raises to the level of a major nonconformity because it's the same issue over and over again that we have seen, even though it's in separate areas. Excuse me. And then there's minor nonconformities. So these just are the ones that we really say that they don't have the capability to shut down your quality management system. We don't believe that the product going out the door is suspect. It's more that you're just not meeting the intent of the specific standard or regulation, and that it needs to be fixed to assure that it doesn't raise to the level of a major nonconformity. So what actions do we require as a notified body when you have a nonconformity at a manufacturing facility? So first is that we will define the time limits for corrective and correction and corrective actions to be implemented. So standard is 30 days. It is not something that is listed anywhere as a requirement. Most notified bodies just, it's easy to remember, and it's also something that corrective actions sometimes are not easy. They're not, depending on what the nonconformance was written for, it can take you some time to figure out what is your root cause, what it is, what do I need to do to fix this issue. So 30 days gives that client enough time to work through this process, get us an idea, and submit a plan that says, okay, we determined this root cause. We believe that these corrections were completed to aid to make sure that product is not leaving the facility that is bad, and that B, here's the plan that we have for all the corrective actions and how long that'll take us. This is really just them, the manufacturers saying, I think that in 6 months that I will be able to do all of these specific items, and then I will close this nonconformance. So this 30-day time frame is not for them to complete everything. It's really just them submitting the plan. We will then review the plan and determine acceptability. So in most cases, we in our template for DECRA, we have check boxes that say, is the root cause acceptable? Were the corrections completed? Does the corrective action actually answer or correct the problem noted in the root cause? We will review all of this information and say, yes, we agree with it, or no, please, your root cause maybe doesn't quite make sense about what we saw. Could you clarify? Or your corrective actions do not really tie back to your root cause. We're looking for those kinds of information. If they're not, we'll let them know. We'll let them make changes, submit back to us, and then determine our acceptability. After that time, they will tell us when they think they will be able to complete all the actions within their response. So within their plan, any actions that they state, we will make note on our end to say, okay, we will check back with you again to make sure this has all been complete. Again, no set time frame for this per any standard. Normally people say 90 days. And the reason that is again, if this nonconformance is something that's causing products to be released that are not within specification, we don't want those products to be continually shipped into the market. We don't also want to unduly, stop products from entering the market. So we will say, okay, 90 days, in most time 3 months. you should be able to get all your corrections, get all your corrective actions in place and get back to us. That doesn't mean that we can't extend it based on the, if it is a really difficult change. Sometimes a corrective action could be installation of new equipment. In that case, obviously 90 days may not be enough time. So as long as they can tell us why that it's going to take longer and give us a time frame that's reasonable, we will accept that time frame. And then we will just, like I said, once that is up, I contact the facility. I ask them to send me all the data that shows me that they have closed any corrective actions, that they have been completed. And then also their data to say, did they do a verification of effectiveness? And did they determine that the corrective actions actually were effective in stopping the issue that was noted? Once they've determined that, yes, everything is effective and it's good, we will do our own verification of effectiveness as well, which usually happens at the next audit. So what we'll do is when we go back in, we'll verify that we still don't see this issue and that, yep, everything they did has corrected it, and we can close the nonconformance. So the last step that we have here really is the granting of the certificate. So we will only grant certificates once major nonconformances are completely closed and minor nonconformances have an accepted plan. The reason for that is for minor nonconformances, we're not worried about the product. For major, we are. So we do not want to grant a certificate that says that we agree that this product manufacturing is within scope of the certificate until we see that everything has been completely fixed and closed. We will also then at that time propose a scope for the certificate. So if you are a brand new facility, we'll discuss with you what we think a proper scope would be for your site. As an example, manufacturing or design, manufacturer, and sales of catheters, something into that effect. We do discuss with the manufacturer to make sure that the scope is actually what they intended to be doing. I've had cases where they said, no, we actually are a design center only. We will not be doing any manufacturing. That process is handled by another facility. So we just make sure that we are covering what they are expecting to see, and also that it meets what we have seen during the audit. This audit, once we create the audit report, so myself as a project manager auditor, my job is to conduct the audit, create my report. My report then will have all my proposals for scope for the certificate, my proposal for the expiration date of the certificate, proposal for any changes that might need to be made if it's a recertification audit to the certificate. And that goes through our review process. So we have what we call them certification management. Their job is to review my report to say, yes, everything that I have done, my scope that I've proposed, the corrective actions that have been closed or at least have a plan, all meet the certification process that has been defined within DECRA. This review then is, once completed and once they have determined that everything is acceptable, they will then issue what we call is just our notice of approval, which is on our end just something that says, yes, the person who was the certification manager has reviewed everything that I have submitted and assured that it has met all of the DECRA procedures and that a certificate can be sent. Thus, once we get that approval, our certificates are created and they will be sent to the site along with the report that we have created. In the surveillance audits, the certificates do not get updated. Then in that case, they will only get an audit report. We will only send an actual certificate upon creation of a new certificate for a new certification period. So once one is expired, the next one will be created. One thing that is to note here is, obviously, we don't want somebody's certificate to expire prior to us issuing a new certificate, because in many cases, it stops them being able to sell into a certain market. So what we will do when we do recertification audits is start that audit. We generally do 6 months prior to the expiration date of their certificate. This gives us plenty of time to plan for the audit, conduct the audit, go through our review process, which sometimes can be a long process if there's a lot of questions from the reviewer, and all of that, and have a new certificate created prior to theirs expiring. However, the certificates are created not on the date that I should say the creation date is not the date that it was actually typed up. So although we say we will issue a new certificate, the start date will not be until the day after the last one expires. So you may get sometimes a couple months in advance of your certificate expire, our report and a new certificate. However, it'll say start date is not until sometime into the future. So there will never be two certificates issued for one standard at the same time. There will always only be one. Okay. I did kind of want to talk a little bit about the removal process for certification. So certificates can be suspended, withdrawn, or have scope reductions. Each audit, we will make a decision after the audit as to whether or not the certificate remains effective. So that being said, we are not allowed to go out, find major nonconformances, and say, oh, yeah, the certificate is still valid, you know, no worries. Each time that we do this, there are specific items that we are looking for to say, is there any reason why I need to start the process of a suspension of a certificate? So reasons why we can remove a certificate. One is auditors are not allowed to conduct audits. So we go out to a facility or we contact a facility to set up audits, and they keep saying, no, you can't come. No, you can't come. If we can't conduct our audits, we will not keep a certificate out there as valid. Non-conformances are not closed in agreed timelines. So this comes into play where if we cannot come to agreement that many times where they say, well, this is our root cause, these are what we're going to do corrective actions. And the corrective actions are supposed to be done in 90 days. And it's now 6 months and we haven't seen any evidence that these actions are being taken and things are trying to be corrected. We will start the process of suspension of a certificate. Persistent serious failures. So this is really where every year, or maybe multiple times a year, because I might come out for special audits as well if you're having major nonconformances. If you have the same problem, or even if it's just that there's a major issue after major issue after major issue, we can start the suspension. So an example for this that we did have is a supplier who had not conducted their annual review for sterilization. This is a requirement. It's showing that nothing has changed in your process to assure that your sterilization parameters don't need to be changed. It had been 2 years in a row where they had missed this. In between, they had conducted it, but when we came back the next year again, it had been missed, and they said, oh, they'd get it done. But we started the suspension process for their certificate, because I can't guarantee that that product was actually sterile when it went out the door, because I had no proof that something in manufacturing hadn't changed enough that they would have had to change their sterile dose. So, and the last one is just client requesting transfer of process to another notified body. So we talked about this a little bit before. Notified bodies, we get busy. We sometimes something happens and we no longer have the ability to do something like maybe we've lost all of our qualified sterilization auditors, or maybe we've lost, we have no auditors anymore that can do animal tissue. So those types of things, a client might have to switch notified bodies. And in that case, then we will also start the process of withdrawing their certificate to assure that there's not a dual certificate out there when they switch to the new notified body. So just as I explained in the past, we can't have 2 certificates out there for the same product and scope. We don't want that to happen when for DECRA and let's say TUV. We don't want 2 out there for the same manufacturer. Just kind of a quick little overview. So the way that our process works is suspension is first, which just means, actually I should change that, that it's still an acceptable certificate. However, we are not going to renew it. So what the process is on ours when we take these actions is the first thing is just what we call a letter of warning. It's just saying, hey, the easiest example of this is after the audit is over, I've issued you my audit report that shows that you have a major nonconformance. I might also send a letter to just remind you that this is very important for us to renew your certificate, that this major nonconformance is closed. And I will usually remind you that you have so many days to close this in, otherwise I will start the suspension process. It's just one of those things to just say, hey guys, this is really important. Make sure that you're taking this seriously, because we will start this process. So like I said, then there's the suspension, which is we don't completely remove the certificate. What we will do is we will notify any like MDSEP organizations that there's been some problems, they're taking action, but for now we're going to suspend this certificate because those actions might take longer than the 90 days, and we don't want them to continue selling product until at this point that they've corrected it. It's usually done in a situation where we know that they're trying, but they're not just going to be able to get it done in the time frame we want to see it. A withdrawal is a total withdrawal of the certificate. If we withdraw a certificate, it means that we are no longer certifying the quality management system and any products that fall under that management system, and that if they're using that ISO certificate to register in any companies, it actually, we will tell those countries that we've withdrawn the certificate. It no longer is, an acceptable certificate, so that they can actually start the process on their ends of possibly removing registrations. If you reinstate a suspended certificate, it's a very easy process. It's just us going back through and saying, okay, now everything has been corrected. The certificate's now issued on this date with an expiration date of 3 years later. Withdrawal of a certificate actually starts the process over. They actually have to start beginning again, like they are a new client, go through the stage 1 audit, the stage 2 audit, and get the full initial audits completed prior to us reissuing their certificate. And in many cases, once we withdraw a certificate, we will never actually issue it again. The situations that cause us to withdraw certificates are usually high enough that we no matter what the company does, we don't usually feel comfortable saying, yeah, that we will recertify them under any kind of aspect. Other little thing just kind of wanted to bring up with certificates. So I talked a little bit before. We issue a certificate to a specific standard / regulation. So we have a specific certificate for MDSAP, a specific certificate for ISO 1345, a specific certificate for CE marking in Europe. Each of those certificates are on their own. This process of removal will it's really for one certificate. It doesn't mean that we can't remove them all based on one issue, but each one would then go through its own process, mainly because there's differing reasons with each of the processes of why you'd possibly remove a certificate. So ISO 1345 certificates tend to be the base. What I would say, it's our start. All the rest kind of build off of that certificate. If we remove their ISO certificate, questions normally for their MDSAP certificates come up right away, because it's very heavily based off of ISO 1345. CE marking might be a little different, but each of these certificates, you know, we would look at them separately and start the process for each one on their own. If I remove one, doesn't mean I'm automatically removing the others. And in many cases, we have some clients that will only do one certificate. So, you know, we have some that have everything, and we have some that will only be ISO 1345 only. And that's the only system that we'll look at when we go out. Beyond that, my slide deck will not move. Oh, yeah. So that's really all I have to talk about today. We can open it up for any questions, and I will stop sharing if I can find the button again.
Billy Joe, thank you. Thank you very much. I know we're running up against the clock for time, but there are a couple of questions. So, Sandra, is it okay if we take one or two questions just before we hand back to finish?
Yes, we certainly appreciate your taking this extra time. We have really a very large audience that means that everybody is very interested on continue learning from you. So thank you very much, Eamon and BJ.
Okay, thank you. BJ, I think you might have answered the first question in your presentation, but Sheila just asked who decides the wording for the scope on the certificate. Is it the auditing organization or the organization being audited? And I think you said that it's an agreement between the two, but perhaps you could just elucidate that.
Yep, it is an agreement between the two. So usually I will create my first draft, take it to them and ask them, does this make sense as to what your expectations are? And then we'll go from there. But then the final decision is our certification management to make sure that we're within our procedures and processes, that we're not stating something we shouldn't. Okay,
thank you. I'm going to take the next question that's in English and then ask for translation of a couple of the others. Just my Spanish is not good enough to make sure that I get the translation right. So Carlos has asked what requirements could change in an assessment process between an ISO 13485 and an MDSAP audit for a manufacturer, depending on the scope of the audit.
So for ISO 1345, well, maybe it's easier to answer it the other way. MDSAP will follow the MDSAP process. So the audit will change, obviously, because the MDSAP audit process is very rigid. It's got set questions that we need to answer, and as we work through all of the different tasks and stuff like that. So in that case, it's truthfully just the audit would be different. ISO, we do kind of a process audit approach within DECRA, but each DECRA auditor can kind of change how that happens as long as we are covering all the different subsections of the ISO document, whereas MDSAP is much more preset. That being said, that's the audit only. When it comes to the process of determining whether or not we will issue a certificate, the certificates that are issued and all of that, those would remain the same through the process. In the end, it's just saying, yes, we agree that they meet the minimum requirements for us to issue this certificate.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we could, Maria asked the question, it's in Spanish, perhaps we could get a translation of Maria's question, please?
Yes, sure. Ricardo?
Claro, las voy a leer para el foro en general.
Sure, I'm going to read them for everybody and in Spanish, and we will translate it. How long, Maria Flores is asking, how long does it take to issue the recertification certificates?
So like I said, it can vary. I would say standard, probably about 2 to 3 months. And that's just because of our processing. When we get done with the audit, we have to write their audit report. We have to make sure that any major nonconformances are dealt with, at least to the point where they've gotten their corrective actions completed and that kind of thing. So usually about 3 months. I would say that there's a possibility in some cases, like I said, we give ourselves 6 months because it's gone right up to that time frame.
Gracias. De Juliet Montaño.
Thank you. Then Juliet Montaño is specifically asking DECRA if you have a platform where they can consult the certification of a manufacturer. What is the status of that certification and the type of products covered by that certification? Do you have any platform or website for that?
Oh, a website. Yeah. Yes. So we do. And this is probably not my area of expertise, but if you do go to the DECRA website, there is a process to start the application process and all of that. However, we do not post our certificates online that we've issued. That is something that we leave to each of our clients as their actual property. And so we don't actually put out there, we actually don't even discuss who our clients are with the other clients. It's something that we consider confidential.
There is a hand raised by Frederick, and then we will pass the floor to Eamon also so that you could all participate with this question. So Fred, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to Billy Joe's comment. Not all auditing organizations would have, a listing of their clients on their website. Some of them do in a searchable database form, but they are all required to provide a mechanism by which you can verify the validity of a certificate. So in some cases, some auditing organizations will ask you to email them and ask, is this a valid certificate? Others have a searchable database, but there has to be a mechanism. Different people do it differently.
Thanks, Fred. I don't have anything to add to that.
Gracias, Fred. De hecho, no tengo nada que agregar a ese respecto.
Eduardo, I've got another, I'm going to jump to the end because I've got a question in English, if that's okay. And I'll take that one. I'm sorry to give preference to the English questions, but while you're looking at the Spanish ones, John has asked if we've any recommendations for internal auditors tasked with reporting on ISO 13485 and MDSAP. Billy Joe, any thoughts on that?
I really think that if you go into the MDSAP, it's the guidelines. Why am I forgetting the name of it? But there is a list of every question that you're supposed to ask through every task, what the expectation is and what you're supposed to see and stuff like that. And when it comes to me, for at least for MDSAP, I really find that I still use it, and I know the MDSAP process very well because I audit it all the time, but it's still something to me that I find if you're going to train somebody new, that's how I used to train my auditors. And with the exception of some of the registration aspects and maybe some of the real specific things for each country, like Japan adding in how long you're supposed to keep documentation for or something like that, it actually covers 1345 as well. And so that, you know, in my mind, it's a really great document to start with and to work your process through. And just like I said, just noting that there are some extra things in there that go above and beyond 1345, but in most cases, they actually tell you that as well. So in my mind, that's a great start.
Yes, thank you. So that's the audit approach.
Yes, that one.
I don't have an answer for that. It used to be the companion document. But
Gracias.
Yeah.
Voy a sintetizar un par de
So
preguntas.
thank you very much. I'm going to summarize a couple of questions we have from Mexico because they want to know what is the criteria for the term of a certificate to be of 3 years for MDSAP, you know, and how long would the certificate last for the ISO 13485, the conventional? How long would one last and the other one is only 3 years?
They're actually both 3 years. So we tie them together because since ISO is so much based on, since MDSAP is based so much on the ISO documentation, we tie them together. So when we say we're going to reissue the ISO certificate, we're also reissuing the MDSAP. Fred, you might know better than me. Is that a requirement for us to do 3 years for MDSAP?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a requirement within MDSAP. It actually is a requirement in our regulations when we define a quality management system certificate. It does specify 3 years, but also 17021-1 2015, I believe, which is the rules for credit for auditing organizations to which they were assessed against, does now include a 3-year cycle. So that was only added in the 2015 version, and I think what really held it up. Previously, most certificates were 3 years, except for notified body EU Annex 5 certificates, which were allowed to be up to 5 years. And so there was sort of this reticence to move away from, you know, to fix it to 3 years. But since under the MDR, they've said, no, everything's 3 years now. IC in 17021 opted to say it's a 3-year cycle. Everyone's on the same cycle because having different years, duration was really chaotic to try to synchronize different certification cycles, and you would end up with incoherent situations where you have, during the same audit, one portion of the audit is only surveillance, but another portion of the audit is a recertification, and you were getting these very incoherent situations. So I'm happy to say that everyone's moved to 3 years now. A lot simpler.
It's a lot easier.
Thank you. Eduardo,
Bueno,
I think...
adicionalmente, también cabe... Perdón. Bueno, adicionalmente, también, cabe mencionar para los...
Additionally,
para las autoridades que...
I wanted to say also that for the authorities, even they have these certificates, the authorities will never lose their sovereignty to apply their attributions, you know, and if they use that, as Fred was mentioned, they could do this witnessed audits, or they could testify to this situation in any moment.
That is correct. And I mean,
una más que se incorpora al anterior es...
We have one more question, which is the audits or the certificates, are they granted by family of products, or can they be granted for a specific product?
For an ISO 13485 certificate, it's more of a family. I don't know how to explain this. We don't list specific medical devices down to names and model numbers. It's more on a broad definition of the type of medical device that they are manufacturing. I think the point to make there is that it's the governing body of the country that they're going into that's registering a device. We are not, except for outside of Europe, but like for Canada, Japan, those places, we are not certifying that device and saying that it is properly registered for that market.
Thank you. And lastly, we have one from Sofia Rivera, but I think that that was answered with the last slides on BJ's presentation, because she's asking what type of documents do you review in the initial audit? You know, the documentary evidence, what documents do you present, and how long would this process take? What happens if any type of adjustment is required by the requester? Do you have to carry out a new audit, or do you continue with the same audit, or what do you do?
So it depends. It's a terrible way to answer, I know. So if we're talking stage one, we are reviewing just procedures, their quality manual, any procedure that would be noted in that quality manual. That's the review. The stage two of the initial audit then looks at procedures and processes together. If in that process, so let's say if I've done my stage one, let's say I've got my stage two scheduled for 2 months later. Within that 2 months, if they make any changes to those procedures, I have to start my stage one over. I have to make sure that I have reviewed the changes they've made before going out and doing the audit. That is only applicable at the initial. So during the surveillance audits, I'm asking for any changes. I'm making note of those changes. If anything were to start to change the scope, I would actually have to stop that process and say that start the process of suspending their certificate if it was major enough to have changed anything within the scope that I had issued at that initial audit. I hope that answered the question.
Well, apparently that's all we have for now. Thank you very much, everybody, for Frederick and all the speakers. Thank you for staying longer than was expected to answer the questions. And Frederick was answering also on the chat. So yeah, back to you so that we can close the session. Iman, it's up to you now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Billy Joe. Thank you for that detailed presentation on the process of certification. And Fred, thank you for helping out with the questions and answers for our session as well. So with that, I'll bring our session here to a close, and I think I'm handing back to Carlos to close the whole event today. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for your participation and all the great questions that we had.
Thank you, Munber. Thank you very much. Bill, Joe, Frederick, thank you everyone for your participation. And with this, we conclude with this training workshop. Let us hope that this has been useful and interesting for everyone. And as you were able to see, the presentations, the experiences are very valuable for us in this arena. This is just one of the many activities that are done under the MDRC umbrella. We will continue helping with the installation of a better regulation for medical devices, more activities. And with this, we're strengthening the capabilities to increase the adoption of international standards and the life quality of patients, reducing technical objects to trade and improving public management by the interaction between the government and the industry for for the construction of a harmonized system. Let us hope that this shared effort can help all of the involved parties to follow the same direction and facilitate a regulatory scheme that is more global. On behalf of the Federal Commission and sending the best regards of Dr. Alejandro Spach, the Federal Commissioner for the Protection Against Sanitary Risks, we thank the willingness, the availability of the speakers and the attendees, and we acknowledge the very relevant contributions of our presenters. Frederick, on behalf of Fed Canada, thank you. Billy Joe, on behalf of ECRA, as well as thank you, Emma Hockey, on behalf of AMI. And to my colleague, Edgardo, thank you very much for all of your support. And finally, last but not least, to all of the staff and the interpreters who were also helping us with the communication. Thank you very much. We thank the representatives of the Alliance for No Standards, to all of the members. Thank you so much. People who have been represented by the work of our dear colleague Sandra Ligia Gonzalez. And it is to her that we pass the floor now, so that on behalf of the Alliance, she can conclude, and perhaps we could take a screenshot of all of the attendees. And with this, we conclude. We will finish by listening to Sandra. Sandra, please go ahead. Thank you very much. There's nothing else to say but to thank everyone and congratulate everyone, as Carlos has said. As usual, we had a very important participation. In this case, we congratulate ourselves because we had presence of all of the regulators from throughout the Americans. At the peak, we had more than 300 participants from all over the continent, so that you can see how much interest there is to learn more about the subject matter. And not only that, but also it is a way in which we acknowledge the experience, the knowledge, and the kindness of the presenters today. And as Carlos has said, this is a joint effort. This is something that we're carrying out because we're fully committed to keep on collaborating in all of the things that we have identified together, both the regulators as well as the regulated sector, to move ahead in a more effective way towards regulatory harmonization. ISO 13485 for a sector is so relevant that, well, it creates the foundations for the correct and safe production of medical devices in terms of their fundamental requirements. And so with this, by having regulations that are based on this standard, we will be able to be safer, more efficient in all of our regulatory convergence processes that will be translated into reliance mechanisms between the world's regulators, not only within our region. And finally, as we have discussed in previous meetings, another element for us to continue being in compliance with the obligations that our governments have regarding the commitments that have been established, as Carlos Gardo have explained, through bilateral or regional commercial agreements, even with the World Trade Organization. Well, with all of this, we congratulate ourselves. We thank everybody for your participation, and we will be taking a picture, and as Carlos has proposed, so that we can have a souvenir of this moment. So we thank you, and we will be sending you the invite for the next event, because there are many other things to learn. Thank you, everyone. Don't leave.